Most founders get stuck chasing validation. Surveys, interviews, feedback loops, hoping that just one more data point will finally give them certainty. But here's the truth. You'll never have perfect validation because startups are not an exact science, and no funnel ever converts anywhere near a 100% conversion rate. After validating hundreds of business models, I've realized something. The question isn't how do I get perfect validation? The question really is how do I know when I have sufficient evidence to move forward? And that's where the minimum success criteria framework comes in. It tells you exactly when you have enough evidence to move forward confidently. Because the biggest mistake isn't launching too early, it's validating for too long. So let's dive in. Now, before we get into the framework itself, let me show you the 3 ways founders waste time on validation. Trap number 1 is confusing learning with traction. I've had many founders over the years come to me and say, "You'd be proud because I followed your process and ran over 50 customer interviews." I tell them that's great because I know that getting outside the building and talking to customers is really hard. But then I ask them a follow-up question. So how many customers did you end up converting? And when that number is a disappointingly low number or near 0, that doesn't make me happy or proud. In startups, you don't get a gold star for following a process, but achieving results. And the only results that matter is traction. Sure, we need to engage and talk to customers to learn, but if you can't convert that learning into meaningful and repeatable traction, that's not the right kind of learning. Trap number 2 is waiting for statistical significance. Some founders treat startups like science experiments. They dismiss talking to customers as not statistically significant and instead chase other types of experiments like driving traffic to a landing page in search of hitting that magical statistical significance conclusion. First, talking to customers is indeed the fastest way to learn. When 10 out of 10 people tell you they don't really want your product, that is not only statistically significant, but more importantly, if you follow up and ask them why, it becomes readily obvious what you need to do next. Now, while running experiments with landing pages can seem more efficient at the outset, people grossly underestimate just how much traffic and, more importantly, actual conversions that you will need to collect before you can hit statistical significance. It's a lot higher than most people think, and most landing page conversion rates are a lot lower than most people expect. This combination makes landing pages a terrible first experiment to run, especially for a new, unproven product. Now, when you have limited startup runway, especially, you can't afford to wait for statistical significance. You need to learn how to make good decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty and move forward. And finally, let's get to trap number 3, which is overplan. I see founders spending months creating pixel-perfect pitch decks, 5-year financial models, comprehensive competitive analysis, and elaborate business plans. Then they launch and learn it's all wrong. This isn't being thorough, this is analysis paralysis disguised as fake validation. So with that, let's get into the minimum success criteria decision framework. Here is the core principle. You don't need perfect validation, you need minimum sufficient evidence. At every stage of the journey, it helps to ask what's the smallest, not largest outcome that we need to acquire to deem our project as still alive. And the most important bit here is that you need to define your minimum threshold before you start, not after. The next most important bit is getting clear on how you measure this minimum success criteria outcome. The outcome is not some vague or qualitative vibe like I feel good about this, or everyone I talk to love my idea, or my advisor said it's a good idea. Your minimum success criteria outcome needs to be specific, measurable, and tied to the only metric that matters in a startup, which is traction. So how do you do this? It helps to model out your minimum success criteria at 3 levels: the founder level, the 90-day cycle level, and the experiment level. Let's start with the first. The founder level minimum success criteria defines your why. Why are you, the founder, even working on this idea in the first place? Think of it as the smallest outcome that would deem your startup project a success for you 3 years from now. Why 3 years? I like to use 3 years because it's sufficiently long for most products to achieve product market fit, but not so far into the future that it becomes impossible to plan against. A key mistake I often see when setting this goal is asking how big my idea can get, but founder level minimum success criteria has nothing to do with your specific idea. I know this may sound a bit confusing, but that's because the founder level minimum success criteria starts with sizing up your personal goal or ambition independent of your product. Why would you ever work on a project that couldn't hit your minimum personal goal? This is the essence of what I call founder model fit. Most people launch a product, then search for a business model, and many get disappointed along the way when the business model doesn't hit their minimum success criteria goal, which they never set in the first place. This, in my book, is backwards. A better approach is to start instead by defining your founder level minimum success criteria and then search for possible ideas and business models that can potentially hit your goal and ignore all other projects that don't have a chance. This is where business model stress testing comes in, and it's the first step that I recommend all founders run as soon as possible, ideally before you start. And if you've already started, then the next thing you should do is run this stress test. This is how you tell if your idea is worth pursuing in the first place, and if it's not, this is the time to fix it before it's too late. If you want to learn how to run this stress test, you should check out the Business Model Design Challenge, which I've linked in the description below. So let's move on to the level 2 minimum success criteria, which is the 90-day cycle level. Now, once you have your founder level minimum success criteria defined and an idea that could potentially deliver on your goal, the next step is breaking that 3-year goal into a much smaller 90-day goal, which is that second level minimum success criteria. Now, why 90 days? For a couple of reasons. First, 3 years, while it's good for founder level goal setting, it is quite far out into the future for a startup or project level goal, especially when you are working with an idea that is constantly changing and evolving until you find product market fit. This is why I prefer 90-day goals, and I find that 90-day minimum success criteria is the right cadence or window to use. 90 days or a quarter is much shorter, of course, than 3 years, but it's not too short to make meaningful and measurable progress on traction. And if you make a yearly growth rate assumption, it then becomes fairly trivial to extrapolate your 3-year goal into a 90-day traction goal. And this becomes the goal that you focus on now for the next 90 days. In other words, this is what you have to ask yourself. What is the minimum amount of traction I need to achieve in the next 3 months to deem my project as still alive? It's important to emphasize that this isn't a number that you simply guess or pull out of thin air. It needs to be derived from your 3-year goal and your growth rate assumption. And this is how you know if you're making meaningful progress on your startup idea or not. If you hit the goal, level up and take on the next 90-day goal and keep plowing forward. And if you don't, this is where it's your cue to pause and consider an appropriate pivot or course correction to get you back on track. So we have talked about 3-year founder level minimum success criteria. We have talked about the 3-month or 90-day minimum success criteria, but even these can be too far out into the future when making daily decisions on what campaign or experiment or task to focus on. This is where level 3 or the experiment level minimum success criteria comes in. And you've probably figured this out by now, but the key here is making your experiment window even smaller than 90 days. I like to cap all my experiments to being no longer than 2 weeks, and many of the experiments I run nicely fit into a weekly window or sometimes even just a few days. Now, it's not usual or even possible most of the times to achieve traction with such a small window, and this is why further deconstruction is required. You can deconstruct traction into smaller sub-steps. Before you earn money from a customer, you have to earn their trust. And before you earn their trust, you have to earn their attention. These are natural steps in the conversion system that powers every customer lifecycle. You earn attention at the acquisition step, you earn trust at the activation step, and you earn revenue at the revenue step. Now, there's a fourth currency here that you can see in this visual, and that is referrals. And it's a measure of goodwill that you also earn from your customers. Now, these steps are universal and driven by a conversion rate at each of the steps, which again is easy to measure. And even if you don't have the most accurate numbers, they're easy to find online or even estimate. And that is the key to extrapolating your 90-day traction goal down to specific sub-metrics that you can use to deem if your experiment was successful or not. So let's put all this theory into action with a concrete example. So when a founder comes to me and says, I just closed 5 customers in 2 weeks, that seems like progress, and at some level it is, because more customers is always a good thing. But the more important question is that enough progress? The only way to answer that question is by running it through the 3 levels. In level 1, this is where, let's assume at the minimum success criteria founder level, the founder has a goal of hitting a $1 million annual recurring revenue or ARR in 3 years. They have worked out a business model to achieve this by targeting a big enough customer segment at a $100 a month price point. Now, you can do the math here for yourself, but in order to achieve this goal, they will need to acquire 833 customers by the end of year 3. I'll round this up to 1,000 active customers to keep the estimates just nice and simple. Level 2, we can then extrapolate this number down to 90 days by assuming a yearly growth rate. For startups, I recommend that most people start with a 10x growth rate and adjust accordingly from there. And if we use that 10x growth rate, this would mean they would need to have, by the end of year 1, 10 customers, by the end of year 2, 100 customers, and by the end of year 3, roughly 1,000 customers. You can see how these numbers help visualize a traction roadmap, which is key to answering the "was this experiment successful" question I asked early on, provided you have one additional input, and that is the current stage or the 90-day cycle that the product currently is in. Earlier the journey, closing 5 customers in 2 weeks would categorize as a success, but that is too low a threshold in the journey when, as you can see from this model, the team would need to close more like 75 customers a month, which is about 40 customers in a 2-week period, a far cry from the 5 customers this founder reported. What you're seeing here is our traction modeling tool that helps you determine what your customer factory needs to be producing at different points in your startup journey, broken down from the founder level minimum success criteria into 90-day goals and down to the experiment level success metrics you can use to measure your experiments. Now, the power of this kind of minimum versus maximum success criteria setting is that these numbers are the floor and not the ceiling. And so when a founder asks me if it's okay to miss their numbers, I tell them to visualize their minimum success criteria as the water level in an ocean. Is it okay to be underwater? We can all hold our breath for some amount of time, but not forever and not for too long. Similarly, most experiments will start out underperforming against our goals, and that's okay for a little while, but it's our job as founders to quickly get a bit uncomfortable and get ourselves above water before running out of air or resources in a startup. Again, if you want to put these concepts to practice, check out the business model design course, which includes the traction modeling tool I just showed you. Thinking about success criteria this way helps you confront your brutal realities in your startup sooner rather than later, sooner being the key word. The goal here isn't outright avoiding failure, because that's impossible to do in a startup when you're operating under conditions of extreme uncertainty, but rather the goal here is being able to tell as quickly and early as possible when something is headed down the wrong path, so that you can pivot and course correct before it's really too late. And speaking of failure, since we are almost at the end of the year, I thought it would be timely to share some of my failed project and initiatives of the year that I undertook in 2025. That's going to be the topic of next week's video. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you then.